What would you do if a freezing child knocked on your door in the middle of the night, begging for help, when you're the last person anyone in town would trust? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Aiyana, and I learned long ago that some wounds never heal. They just teach you to live with the pain. The wind howled through the canyon walls like the voices of my ancestors, reminding me of everything I'd lost. 3 winters had passed since I'd been cast out from my people, and 2 since the last person from Red Canyon had spoken to me without spitting in the dirt afterward. My small canvas shelter sat perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the town below, close enough to trade my leatherwork for supplies, far enough to avoid the stares and whispered threats. The Apache called me dead to them. The white settlers called me dangerous. I called myself nothing at all anymore. That November night, the first real snowfall of the season, painted the desert white, unusual for Arizona territory. I sat cross-legged on a worn buffalo hide, working by lamplight to repair a saddle I'd traded for. My fingers moved automatically through the familiar motions: punch, thread, pull tight. The repetitive work kept my hands busy and my mind from wandering to darker places. The leather was good quality, probably from Samuel Hartwell's general store down in Red Canyon. Hartwell was one of the few who'd still do business with me, though he always made sure to count his money twice and check his inventory after I left. Trust, I'd learned, was a luxury men like me couldn't afford. A sudden gust rattled my shelter's frame, and I paused to add another piece of dried mesquite to my small fire. The flames danced higher, casting shifting shadows on the canvas walls. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of laughter from the town saloon, a reminder of the warm brotherhood I'd once known among my people before I'd made the choice that destroyed everything. I was reaching for my water gourd when I heard it, tap, 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 soft knocking on the wooden post that supported my shelter's entrance. My hand instinctively moved to the knife at my belt as I listened. Could be a drunk cowboy looking for trouble. Could be Deputy Morrison finally working up the courage to run me out of the territory. Could be nothing at all, just branches blown against the canvas by the wind. But then came a voice, small and shaking. "Please, is anybody there?" I froze. A child's voice, high and desperate. In 3 years of isolation, no child had ever approached my camp. Their parents warned them about the savage on the mountain, filled their heads with stories of what happened to little ones who wandered too close to Apache camps. "Please," the voice came again, weaker now. "I'm so cold." Every instinct told me to stay silent, to let whoever it was move on. Nothing good could come from a white child being found at my shelter. If something happened to this young one, if they were hurt or scared or simply reported being here, the townspeople would have all the excuse they needed to form a hunting party. But that voice, it reminded me of my younger brother's voice, the night our village was attacked by cavalry soldiers, the night I'd failed to protect him. I set down the leather and moved quietly to the entrance flap. Through a small gap in the canvas, I could make out a tiny figure huddled against the wooden post, shivering violently in clothes too thin for the sudden cold snap. Snow was already collecting on the child's dark hair. My throat tightened. Whatever had driven this little one up the treacherous mountain path in a snowstorm, it had to be worse than the stories they'd heard about me. I took a deep breath and pulled back the flap. The child looked up with wide, frightened eyes. A boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with skin pale from cold and lips tinged blue. His clothes were little more than rags, torn and dirty, offering no protection against the elements. But it was his eyes that struck me most. Old eyes in a young face, the look of someone who'd seen too much pain for his years. "You're the Indian," he whispered, not with fear but with something like recognition. "I am Apache," I replied carefully, my English rusty from disuse. "What brings you to my camp, young one?" The boy's teeth chattered so violently he could barely speak. They locked me in the cold room again. Said I wouldn't get food for 3 days this time, but it's so cold, and I heard if I could make it up here, maybe... He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I'd heard whispers about Hartwell's orphanage, about children who disappeared in the night or showed up to town with suspicious bruises. Most folks turned a blind eye. Orphans were a burden, and if someone was willing to house and feed them, questions weren't asked. 3 days without food, I repeated, anger building in my chest like flames finding dry kindling. The boy nodded miserably. I dropped his coffee cup this morning. It was an accident, but Mr. Hartwell said accidents have consequences. I studied his thin frame, the way his shoulders shook from more than just cold. This child was starving, had been for some time by the look of him, and someone had sent him out into a snowstorm as punishment for a broken cup. Every reasonable voice in my head screamed warnings. Send him back. This isn't your problem. Think of the consequences. But louder than reason was the memory of my brother's voice, calling for help I'd been too late to give. I stepped aside and held the flap open wider. Come, I said simply. Warm yourself by my fire. The boy's eyes widened in disbelief. Really? You won't hurt me? The question hit harder than any blow I'd ever taken. I have never harmed a child, I said quietly. I never will. He hesitated for just a moment longer, then stumbled past me into the shelter. I secured the flap against the wind and turned to find him collapsed near my fire, holding his small hands toward the flames with desperate gratitude. What is your name? I asked, settling onto my buffalo hide and reaching for a thick wool blanket I'd traded for last winter. Ethan, he whispered. Ethan. I don't remember my last name anymore. I wrapped the blanket around his thin shoulders, noting how he flinched slightly at the contact before relaxing into the warmth. I am called Aiyana. Aiyana, he repeated carefully. That's a pretty name. It means eternal flower in my language. My mother chose it because she said I was born during the spring when the desert bloomed. For the first time since he'd arrived, Ethan smiled. A small, tentative expression that transformed his entire face. She sounds nice. She was. I reached for my water gourd and a piece of dried venison. Are you hungry, Ethan? His eyes fixed on the food with desperate longing, but he shook his head. Mr. Hartwell says I don't deserve to eat when I break things. Mr. Hartwell is not here, I said firmly, holding out the meat, and no child deserves to go hungry for any reason. Ethan took the food with trembling hands and bit into it like he hadn't eaten in days, which I realized he probably hadn't. As he chewed, tears started streaming down his face. Easy, little brother, I said gently, using the Apache term of endearment without thinking. You are safe now. But even as I spoke the words, I wondered if they were true, because looking at this broken child by my fire, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years of isolation. The fierce protective instinct that had once made me willing to die for my people. And that instinct was about to change everything. Chapter 2. I watched Ethan sleep by my fire, curled under the wool blanket like a wounded animal finally finding shelter. The boy had eaten slowly, carefully, as if expecting the food to be taken away at any moment. When I'd offered him water, he'd drunk it with the same desperate gratitude, but it was when he'd asked, "Can I really stay until morning?" that something cracked open in my chest, something I'd thought was dead and buried with my old life. "You can stay as long as you need," I'd told him, and meant it. Now, as dawn light filtered through the canvas walls, I faced a problem I hadn't anticipated. In 3 years of exile, I'd grown comfortable with solitude. My days followed a simple pattern: hunt or gather food, work leather, trade in town when necessary, avoid human contact whenever possible. It was a life stripped down to bare survival, but it was mine. A child changed everything. Ethan stirred as the light grew stronger, blinking up at me with confusion, before memory returned. His face brightened with relief, as if he'd feared the kindness had been a dream. "You're still here," he whispered. "Where would I go? This is my home." He sat up slowly, the blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. "I should probably get back soon. Mr. Hartwell will be angry if he finds my bed empty. The casual acceptance in his voice, the way he spoke of returning to certain punishment, sparked anger in me again. But I kept my expression calm. Fear would not help this child. "Are you often locked in this cold room?" I asked. Ethan's gaze dropped to his hands. "Only when I mess up, which is more than I'd like." "And the other children at the orphanage?" "There's only 3 of us left. Mary's real quiet and never causes trouble. And Tommy, well, Tommy learned to stay out of Mr. Hartwell's way after what happened to his arm." The words were spoken matter-of-factly, but they painted a picture that made my jaw clench. "What happened to Tommy's arm?" "Broke it falling down the stairs. At least, that's what Mr. Hartwell told the doctor." Ethan met my eyes briefly. "Tommy says he doesn't remember falling." I had to look away to keep my expression neutral. In my years among the Apache, I'd seen many forms of cruelty, but there was something particularly vile about those who preyed on the helpless. Among my people, children were sacred, protected by the entire tribe, never harmed regardless of circumstances. "Ethan," I said carefully, "what would happen if you simply didn't go back?" His eyes widened. "I can't do that. I'm bound to Mr. Hartwell until I'm 16. That's the law, and besides," he pulled the blanket tighter, "where would I go? Who would want me?" The question hung in the air between us. Outside, I could hear the sounds of Red Canyon waking up, dogs barking, horses neighing, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Life continuing as normal while a child contemplated returning to abuse because he believed he had no other choice. "I would want you," I said quietly. Ethan stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "But you're Apache," I finished. "Yes, and I'm a child who needs protecting." I leaned forward slightly. "Among my people, family is not always about blood. Sometimes the spirits bring people together for reasons we don't understand until much later." "The spirits?" For the first time, curiosity replaced fear in his voice. I found myself sharing stories I hadn't spoken aloud in years, tales my grandmother had told me about how the Creator sometimes uses unexpected meetings to heal wounded hearts. As I spoke, Ethan listened with the intense focus of someone starved for kindness, for connection. But our quiet morning was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. I moved quickly to the shelter's entrance, peering through a gap in the canvas. 3 riders were climbing the narrow path to my camp: Deputy Morrison, Samuel Hartwell, and a man I didn't recognize wearing a town constable's badge. "Ethan," I said urgently, turning back to find the boy had gone pale. "Did anyone see you leave the orphanage last night?" I don't think so." I waited until everyone was asleep. His voice was barely a whisper. "Are they coming for me?" Before I could answer, Hartwell's voice boomed across the camp. "We know the boy's in there, Apache. Send him out, and maybe we won't burn down your little home." I felt the familiar weight of impossible choices. Send Ethan back to certain abuse, or face the consequences of harboring a white child. Consequences that could include imprisonment or worse. But looking at the terror in Ethan's eyes, the way he instinctively moved closer to me for protection, I realized the choice had already been made. Some lines, once crossed, change you forever. "Stay behind me," I told him quietly. "Whatever happens, stay behind me." I pushed through the entrance flap to face the 3 men. Hartwell sat his horse like a man accustomed to authority, his face flushed with anger. Deputy Morrison looked uncomfortable, his hand resting nervously on his gun. The constable studied me with calculating eyes. "Gentlemen," I said evenly, "you are on my land." "Your land?" Hartwell laughed harshly. "You don't own anything, savage. You exist here by our tolerance, nothing more. What do you want?" I kept my voice level, though every instinct screamed at me to reach for my knife. "The boy," the constable said, "Ethan Miller. He ran away from his legal guardian last night. We're here to retrieve him." "I have seen no runaway children." Morrison shifted in his saddle. "Now, Aiyana, we don't want any trouble. But the boy's tracks lead right to your camp, fresh tracks in the snow." Hartwell's eyes glittered with malice. Maybe the savage took him. Maybe he's planning to sell him to his Apache friends. Wouldn't be the first time savages stole white children. The accusation hit like a physical blow. For a moment, I was transported back 3 years to another false accusation, another moment when my character was judged by my blood rather than my actions. "I am no child thief," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Then prove it," Hartwell challenged. "Let us search your camp." Behind me, I heard the soft whisper of canvas as Ethan shifted. One search would reveal him, and then I'd have to watch them drag a terrified child back to a place where broken cups earned days without food. "You have no authority here," I said instead. The constable's hand moved to his weapon. "Actually, I do. Territorial law gives me the right to search for missing persons. Stand aside." 3 armed men against 1 Apache with a knife. The smart move was to step aside, let them find Ethan, claim I'd been helping a lost child, maybe face a fine or a warning, but nothing worse. But smart wasn't always right. "No," I said simply. The word dropped into the morning air like a stone into still water, sending ripples of tension through the group. Hartwell's face darkened with rage. Morrison's hand tightened on his gun, and the constable's eyes narrowed. "That's obstruction of justice," the constable said coldly. "Last chance, Apache. Stand aside, or we'll move you aside." I planted my feet more firmly and crossed my arms. Behind me I could feel Ethan's presence, could imagine his small hands clutched in fists of fear. But I could also remember the trust in his eyes when he'd asked if he could stay until morning. "I will not move," I said, and in that moment, as 3 angry white men prepared to force their way past me to reclaim a child they saw as property, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my exile, the absolute certainty that I was exactly where the spirits intended me to be, even if it meant facing the consequences of protecting someone who needed protection more than I needed safety. The constable's hand was moving toward his gun when everything changed. Chapter 3. The constable's hand froze halfway to his weapon as a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's quite enough, gentlemen." Martha Keene emerged from behind a cluster of rocks, her grey hair pinned severely back, her weathered hands gripping a Winchester rifle with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. At 62, she was one of the few people in Red Canyon who remembered when this territory was truly wild, when survival depended on character rather than the color of one's skin. "Mrs. Keene," Deputy Morrison said, clearly relieved to see a voice of reason. "We're just here to collect the runaway boy. Official business." "Official harassment, more like," she replied crisply, keeping the rifle trained on the group. "I've been watching this little expedition since you left town, and I thought I'd come see what all the fuss was about." Hartwell's face purpled with indignation. "This doesn't concern you, woman. The savage is harboring stolen property." "Stolen property." Martha's voice could have frozen the desert in July. "Are you referring to Ethan as property, Samuel?" The constable held up a hand. "Now, Mrs. Keene, let's keep this civil. The boy is legally bound to Mr. Hartwell's care. We're simply legally bound to a man who locks children in unheated rooms during snowstorms," Martha interrupted. "Because that's what young Ethan was fleeing from, wasn't it?" I felt a surge of gratitude toward this unexpected ally, but kept my expression neutral. Martha Keene had always been different from the other townspeople. She'd lost her husband and 3 sons in various frontier conflicts and had emerged from her grief with a steel spine and an intolerance for injustice. "The boy needs discipline," Hartwell sputtered. "He's willful, destructive. He's 8 years old," Martha snapped. "And if half the stories I've heard about your discipline are true, it's a wonder any child survives in your care." Behind me, I heard the softest whisper of movement as Ethan shifted closer to the entrance flap. I knew he was listening, probably torn between hope and terror. "Look," Deputy Morrison said, clearly wanting to defuse the situation. "Why don't we just ask the Apache if he's seen the boy? Simple question, simple answer." All eyes turned back to me. I could feel the weight of the moment, the choice that would define not just my fate, but Ethan's. In Apache culture, there was no greater shame than failing to protect the innocent. But I also knew that a direct lie would only make things worse if they eventually found evidence of Ethan's presence. "I found a child freezing in a snowstorm," I said carefully. "Apache law requires me to offer shelter to any who need it." "So he is here," the constable said, satisfaction creeping into his voice. "If a child came to my fire, seeking warmth and food, I would not turn him away to die in the cold." Hartwell leaned forward in his saddle. "Where is he now?" I met his gaze steadily. "That depends." "Depends on what?" "On whether he chooses to return to a place where broken dishes earn 3 days without food." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Morrison's face showed genuine shock. Clearly, he hadn't heard the details of Ethan's punishment. Even the constable looked uncomfortable. But Hartwell's reaction was pure rage. "How dare you judge how I run my institution? That boy is a liar and a thief, and if he told you—" "I know what I saw," I interrupted quietly. "A starving child, barely dressed for the weather, terrified of returning to your care." "Lies," Hartwell spat. "All of it. These people will say anything to—" He never finished the sentence, because that's when Ethan himself pushed through the entrance flap. The boy was still wrapped in my blanket, his small face set with a determination that reminded me of young Apache warriors preparing for their first battle. He walked to my side and looked up at the mounted men with eyes far too old for his years. "Mr. Hartwell," he said quietly, "I'm not going back." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt something fierce and protective rise in my chest as I looked down at this child who had found the courage to face his tormentor. "You don't have a choice, boy," Hartwell said coldly. "You belong to me until you're 16. That's the law." "The law," Martha Keene said sharply, "also requires that children be properly fed, clothed, and housed. From what I'm seeing, you failed on all 3 counts. The constable shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Keene, while I appreciate your concern, we still have a legal obligation." "Your legal obligation," she interrupted, "is to ensure the welfare of children in institutional care, and I'm prepared to testify to the territorial governor about what I've witnessed today." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the constable's face. Martha Keene wasn't just any resident of Red Canyon. She was the territorial representative's sister-in-law, and her word carried weight in official circles. Ethan moved closer to me, and without thinking, I placed a protective hand on his shoulder. The gesture wasn't lost on any of the adults present. "This is ridiculous," Hartwell exploded. "You're all going to take the word of a savage and a delinquent child over a man who profits from territorial payments for each orphan in his care?" Martha's voice was deadly quiet. "A man who somehow manages to house and feed children on half the allocation he receives. Yes, Samuel, I think we might just do that." The accusation hit its target. Hartwell's face went pale, then flushed dark red. Morrison and the constable exchanged glances. Clearly, this was news to them as well. "You can't prove anything," Hartwell said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Can't I?" Martha smiled grimly. "I've been keeping records, Samuel, comparing territorial payments to actual expenses. Amazing what a woman with time on her hands can discover." I felt Ethan's small hand grip my arm as he watched his tormentor's authority crumble. But I also knew this confrontation was far from over. Men like Hartwell didn't give up easily, especially when their livelihood was threatened. "Even if that were true," the constable said slowly, "it doesn't change the immediate situation. The boy is legally bound to an institution, not necessarily to this man," Martha interrupted. "If there are concerns about Mr. Hartwell's management, the territorial government might need to review the orphanage's charter." Hartwell's eyes darted between Martha and the constable, calculating. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "Fine," he said coldly, "but the boy comes with us today. Any investigation can be conducted through proper channels." "No," Ethan said quietly but firmly. "I won't go back there. You don't have a choice." "Yes, he does," I said, my voice carrying the finality of a man who had made an irreversible decision. "He has the choice to remain under my protection." The words surprised even me. In all my years of exile, I'd never openly challenged the territorial authority, but looking down at Ethan's trusting face, I realized some things were worth the risk. "Your protection?" Hartwell laughed harshly. "You're a savage without legal standing. You can't protect anyone." "Actually," Martha said thoughtfully, "there might be a way." All eyes turned to her. She stood there in the morning light, rifle still ready, looking like a woman who had just found the perfect solution to an impossible problem. "Territorial law allows for emergency guardianship in cases where a child's welfare is at immediate risk," she continued, "and it allows any territorial resident in good standing to petition for temporary custody pending official review." And the constable frowned. "Mrs. Keene, with respect, Mr. Aiyana isn't—" "I am," she said simply, "and I'm prepared to file that petition today, with Mr. Aiyana serving as the boy's day-to-day guardian under my legal sponsorship." Hope flared in my chest, even as I recognized the enormity of what she was offering. Martha Keene was essentially putting her reputation and legal standing on the line for a child she barely knew and an Apache she'd spoken to perhaps a dozen times in 3 years. "This is insane," Hartwell sputtered. "You can't just—" "Can't I?" Martha's smile was sharp as a blade. "Watch me." She turned to the constable. "I assume you'll need to file a report about today's events?" "Well, yes, but make sure to include my petition for emergency guardianship and my formal complaint about conditions at the Red Canyon orphanage." Her voice hardened. "All of it goes to the territorial capital by the next mail run." The constable looked like a man caught between conflicting loyalties. Finally, he nodded slowly. I'll need to consult with my superiors about the proper procedures." "You do that," Martha said pleasantly. "In the meantime, the boy stays where he is." Hartwell's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. "This isn't over," he said, looking directly at me. "Not by a long shot." As the 3 men turned their horses and began the descent back to town, I felt Ethan's grip on my arm tighten. We had won this battle, but I knew Martha was right. This was far from over, and as I watched Hartwell's retreating figure, I couldn't shake the feeling that my past was about to collide with my present in ways I wasn't prepared for. Because in 3 years of exile, I'd learned that some secrets have a way of surfacing just when you think you're finally safe. Debut. Chapter 4. 3 days had passed since the confrontation, and life had settled into an unexpected rhythm. Ethan helped me with small tasks around the camp, mending gear, gathering firewood, preparing meals. In return, I began teaching him things my father had taught me: how to read animal tracks, how to find water in the desert, how to move silently through brush. But mostly, we talked. "Why were you cast out from your people?" he asked one evening, as we sat by the fire, working together to repair a leather bridle. His small hands had proven surprisingly capable with the simple stitching I'd shown him. I'd been expecting this question, but it still sent a cold knot into my stomach. For 3 years, I'd carried the shame alone. Speaking it aloud felt like opening an old wound. "I made a choice," I said carefully, "that my people could not forgive." "What kind of choice?" I set down the leather and stared into the flames, seeing not the present fire, but another one, burning in Apache territory 3 years ago. There was a raid planned against a cavalry patrol, a trap designed to avenge the death of my cousin at their hands. Ethan stopped stitching, sensing the weight of what I was about to share. I learned that the patrol included soldiers' families, women and children traveling under military escort. The war chief said it made no difference. They were white. They were the enemy. I picked up a stick and stirred the coals, watching sparks dance into the night sky. I could not attack children, even to avenge my blood. "So what did you do?" The question hung between us like smoke. I warned them, sent word through a half-breed trader that they should take a different route. Ethan's eyes widened. You saved them? I saved some children from dying, but in doing so I betrayed my war party. 3 of my Apache brothers died in the failed ambush. The memory still tasted like ashes, including my younger brother, Nalnish. The words came out harder than I'd intended. Ethan set down his needle and moved closer to me, his presence a small comfort against the vastness of my guilt. You chose to save children, he said quietly. That doesn't sound like something to be ashamed of. Try telling that to a father who lost his son because of my choice. I looked down at the boy's earnest face. My brother died calling my name, asking why I had betrayed them. I carry those words every day. We sat in silence for a while, the crackling fire the only sound. Finally, Ethan spoke again. Do you regret it? Warning those families. The question cut straight to the heart of everything I'd wrestled with for 3 years. Every day I regret that my brother died. Every day I wish I could have found another way. I met his eyes. But no, I do not regret saving innocent lives. Then you did the right thing, Ethan said, with the simple certainty of childhood, even if it cost you everything. His words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they offered a forgiveness I'd never been able to give myself. My Apache brothers would disagree, I said softly. Well, Ethan replied, returning to his stitching. Maybe your Apache brothers never had someone save them when they needed it most. Before I could respond to that profound observation, we heard the sound of approaching horses. I tensed, hand moving instinctively toward my knife, but relaxed when I recognized Martha Keene's voice calling out a greeting. She emerged into our firelight, leading 2 pack mules, and wearing the satisfied expression of a woman who had just won a significant victory. Good evening, gentlemen, she said, settling her animals and approaching our fire. I bring news from town. Ethan looked up eagerly. Good news? The best, Martha replied, accepting the cup of coffee I offered her. The territorial governor has approved my emergency guardianship petition. You are now officially under my legal protection with Mr. Aiyana as your designated caregiver. Relief flooded through me so powerfully I nearly dropped my own cup. And Hartwell, Martha's smile turned predatory. Mr. Hartwell is facing a formal investigation into his management of territorial funds. Apparently, my financial records raise quite a few questions in the capital. She sipped her coffee with obvious satisfaction. The orphanage has been temporarily closed, and the remaining children transferred to more appropriate care. What about Tommy and Mary? Ethan asked anxiously. Tommy's arm has been properly treated, and both children are now with families who actually want them, Martha assured him. Tommy specifically asked me to tell you that he hopes you're happy with your Indian friend. And Ethan beamed at that. Over the past 3 days, his entire demeanor had transformed. The fearful, skittish child who'd knocked on my tent had given way to a boy who laughed easily and asked endless questions about everything from Apache customs to the migration patterns of desert animals. But, Martha continued, her tone becoming more serious, there's something else you both need to know. The shift in her voice immediately put me on alert. What is it? Hartwell hasn't given up. With the investigation closing in, he's gotten desperate. She set down her cup and looked directly at me. He's been spreading stories around town about you, Aiyana, claiming you're dangerous, that you've corrupted the boy somehow. What kind of stories? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. The kind that get men drunk and angry, Martha said grimly. He's been talking about Apache raids, about stolen children, about how letting you have custody sets a dangerous precedent. She paused. Yesterday, I overheard him telling a group of cowboys that someone should do something about the situation before other savages get ideas. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I'd lived through enough frontier tensions to know how quickly rumors and fear could explode into violence. Maybe it would be better if I left, I said quietly. Found somewhere else to... No! Ethan's voice was sharp with panic. He grabbed my arm. You can't leave, you promised. Easy, little brother, I said, using the Apache endearment that had become natural between us. I'm not going anywhere. But even as I spoke the reassurance, my mind was racing through possibilities. Martha was right. Hartwell was cornered and desperate, which made him more dangerous than ever. And desperate men often convinced themselves that violence was justified. There's more, Martha said reluctantly. Deputy Morrison came to see me this morning. Off the record, he warned me that some of the men Hartwell's been talking to are, well, they're not the most reasonable folks in the territory. Who? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. Jake Bronson and his crew, she confirmed. The ones who got run out of Tombstone for harassing the Chinese miners. My jaw tightened. Bronson was a known troublemaker with a particular hatred for anyone who wasn't white and Christian. If Hartwell had his ear, the situation was more dangerous than I'd thought. What do we do? Ethan asked, looking between Martha and me with worried eyes. Martha reached into her pack and pulled out an official-looking document. Well, for starters, we make sure everyone knows this guardianship is completely legal and backed by territorial authority. She handed me the papers. These are certified copies. Keep them with you at all times. I unfolded the document, struggling with some of the formal legal language, but understanding the essential meaning. Ethan was now legally under my protection, with the full backing of the territorial government. This should stop any legal challenges, Martha continued, but I'm more worried about illegal ones. As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of multiple horses drifted up from the canyon below. Too many horses for casual travel, moving too fast for a simple journey. I stood and moved to the edge of our camp, peering down into the darkness. Torchlight flickered between the trees, at least 6 or 7 riders, moving steadily up the mountain path toward our position. Martha, I said quietly, take Ethan and get behind the rocks. Now. She didn't argue. Years of frontier life had taught her to recognize danger when she heard it. She quickly gathered Ethan and led him to cover behind the large boulders that ringed our camp. I checked my knife and picked up the Winchester rifle Martha had brought, its weight familiar in my hands. Whatever was coming, I wouldn't meet it unprepared. The torchlight grew brighter as the riders approached. When they finally emerged into our camp's circle of firelight, I counted 8 men, more than I'd feared, but not an impossible number if it came to fighting. Hartwell led the group, flanked by Jake Bronson and several men I recognized as saloon regulars and drifters. All were armed, and most looked like they'd been drinking. "Well, well," Hartwell called out, his voice slurred with whiskey and confidence. "The savage and his stolen boy, enjoying your little victory?" "The boy is legally under my protection," I replied calmly, not moving from my position by the fire. "Territorial documents say so," Bronson spat into the dirt. "Don't care what some paper says, no savage should be raising a white child. It ain't natural. Ain't safe either," added another man. "We all know what Apaches do to captives." I felt the familiar weight of prejudice and fear, the way white men could convince themselves that any violence against my people was justified. But this time was different. This time I had someone to protect who was worth fighting for. "Ethan is not a captive," I said evenly. "He is a boy who needed help, and I gave it to him." "Sure you did," Hartwell sneered, "just like you helped by interfering with lawful authorities." "Lawful authorities who locked an 8-year-old boy outside during a snowstorm," I replied, "for breaking a cup." Some of the men shifted uncomfortably at that. Even in their drunken state, a few seemed to recognize the injustice in what Hartwell had done. But Bronson wasn't deterred. "Don't matter what the boy did or didn't do. Point is, you got no right keeping him. Time to hand him over and clear out of the territory. And if I refuse," Bronson's hand dropped to his gun, "then we take him anyway. And maybe teach you a lesson about knowing your place." The threat hung in the air, like smoke from our fire. 8 armed men against 1 Apache with a rifle and a knife. The smart play was to negotiate, to find some compromise that would satisfy their need for face-saving while protecting Ethan. But as I stood there in the firelight, Facing down men who saw me as less than human, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my exile, the absolute certainty that some things were worth dying for. "You will have to kill me first," I said quietly. And in that moment, as 8 angry men prepared to do exactly that, I heard a voice from the darkness behind them. "I wouldn't recommend that, gentlemen." The riders spun in their saddles as Martha Keene emerged from the shadows, her Winchester trained on Bronson's chest. But she wasn't alone. Deputy Morrison stepped into the light beside her, his badge gleaming and his own rifle ready. Behind him came 2 more men I recognized as territorial marshals. "Evening, Jake," Morrison said conversationally. "Heard you boys were planning a little party up here. Thought we'd join you." Bronson's face went pale. "This ain't your business, Morrison." "Actually, it is," Morrison replied. "See, threatening a lawful guardian in the performance of his duties is a territorial offense. And that's before we get to the part about armed trespass and conspiracy." The marshals spread out, covering the group of would-be vigilantes with practiced efficiency. What had seemed like overwhelming odds moments before now looked more like a group of drunk men who'd badly miscalculated. Hartwell tried one last play. "You can't arrest us for protecting white children from what?" one of the marshals interrupted. "From a man who's been legally appointed as their guardian? From someone who's fed and clothed and protected a child you left to freeze?" The fight went out of the group like air from a punctured balloon. One by one, they lowered their weapons and accepted the marshal's orders to dismount and surrender their guns. As the authorities led the men away, Morrison paused beside me. "Mrs. Keene sent word about what Hartwell was planning," he explained. "Figured you might need some official backup." "Thank you," I said simply. He nodded and started to turn away, then stopped. "For what it's worth, Aiyana, I think the boy's lucky to have you looking out for him." After the last of the riders disappeared down the mountain, Martha and Ethan emerged from cover. The boy ran straight to me, wrapping his arms around my waist with fierce intensity. "I thought they were going to take me away," he whispered against my shirt. "Never," I promised, holding him tightly. "No one will take you from me, not ever." And looking down at this child, who had somehow become the center of my world, I realized that the isolation I'd worn like armor for 3 years had been transformed into something else entirely, a family worth protecting, a future worth building. The desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the sound of my ancestors' voices. But for the first time since my exile, they sounded approving. I had chosen to save a child, and in doing so, had saved myself.